Greetings, creatures of the night. Don't forget, my novel, The Griffin Chronicles, Volume 1, is available on Amazon.com. The link to that book is in the description below. Don't miss your chance to read it. It's available on Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. I would love to hear what you guys think about my book. Now, I hope you enjoy this episode full of Dogman encounters. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream. I've lived in Wisconsin my entire life, and pretty close to Elkhorn too. Close enough to have heard the stories of the Beast of Bray Road. In the 48 years of my life, I never believed it one single time. Until the day that I was made a believer. I used to spend a lot of time at my girlfriend's father's house. Once his wife passed away, he was just so lonely. I've never seen a man that lonely. So my girlfriend and I would just go over and spend time with him. He had this cornfield on the back of his property. Wasn't a big one at all. I think it was more of a hobby for him anyways. But regardless, he'd go out there and he'd work on that corn, grow it and sell it, and use the money to restore this 1959 Chevy Bel Air. That's a good looking car, even to this day. But anyways, he had this scarecrow out there. It wasn't scary by any means. In fact, I thought it was the stupidest thing that I had ever seen. It was still creepy though, just because it was this humanoid figure that was hanging up on a big piece of wood, watching over the corn. I know it's pretty cliche to have one out there, but he'd made it with his late wife and swore it protected the fields from the crows, so we never said anything about it. For as much time as we spent over at his place, I spent just as much time out on the patio. I'd watch the sunrise and the sunset, and I'd watch that cornfield. There was just something about it that I didn't like. Maybe I'd seen signs too many times and I was waiting for crop circles to appear or something. Or maybe it was just that damn scarecrow. But either way, something about that field just made me uneasy. Until one day, it made me damn near terrified. I remember sitting out on the porch, and I just gazed up quickly at the cornfield and looked back down at my book. I thought to myself, hey, Jim moved that stupid scarecrow. But then I immediately looked up and took another glance. It wasn't the scarecrow at all. It was the damn Beast of Bray Road, right there in the flesh. What I looked at first was the back of this massive head. His back and shoulders were just as big. He was a dark brown color, as dark of a brown as you can get without being black. He was moving back and forth through the corn. Like, maybe he was looking for something. Or maybe he was just wandering. I don't know. What I do know is I sat there and watched this creature, mouth hanging open wide in shock. My book fell right out of my hands and landed on the ground. I didn't even know what to do or what to say. All of a sudden, I guess this thing caught my whiff or heard my heart pounding or something. I don't know. But either way, it's like this thing sensed that I was there, and it turned around and looked right at me. At the time, that corn was about 7 feet tall, and that thing was about 2 feet taller than that. Again, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run into the house and scream, but I knew there were 2 lives in that house that depended on me. I needed to get in there and warn them about what I was looking at, but at the same time, my legs felt like jelly. I wasn't moving anywhere. Then this thing just slowly turned around, back to whatever it was doing. Then after that, like it didn't have a care in the world, it just slowly walked off through the corn and I lost sight of it. I just sat there, watching in the direction that it walked off, my body still absolutely trembling. I still didn't know what the hell to even do. And then it was like my brain finally kicked back on. My neurons fired up or something. I slowly got up and walked back into the house. When the other 2 saw me, Debbie said I was as pale could be. I sat down on the couch just trying to figure out what I was going to tell them. How could I tell them that the Beast of Bray Road was just in the cornfield right outside of their house, and that all the stories we've ever heard our entire lives were probably all true? All I could ask for was a glass of water. Honestly, I think I was in shock. At this point, I could tell that they were both worried about me, so I told them everything that I just saw. After that, all three of us just sat in silence for a long time, none of us saying a single word. My mind was still trying to accept what I saw. I didn't know if the two of them were trying to come to terms with that, or if they were trying to figure out how to tell me I was the biggest liar in the world, or maybe the craziest person that they've ever met. Then Jim finally broke the silence. What do you think it wants? I just shook my head and looked at him. I don't know, Jim. Then he looked me in the eye, like he just accepted everything I just told him, and he said, "Will you please make sure Debbie gets home safely tonight?" There was this quiver in his voice, like he was scared but also calm at the same time. It was weird. It was like he just accepted the fact that this thing could come back, could kill him even, and he was okay with it. He just wanted to make sure that his daughter was safe. Like, if he did die, he'd be with his wife again, but he would die knowing that his daughter was still okay. But Deb didn't want to hear anything of the sort, and she went over to him and sat down next to him, grabbing his arm. She said we weren't leaving him alone. I finally shook off that cloud in my head and agreed with her. I told him he wasn't staying at the house alone. He was coming back to our place with us. But, being the stubborn old man that we love, he just shook his head at me and said he wasn't going anywhere. And you know what? At that moment, I knew there was nothing I could do to change his mind. He looked back at Debbie and told her, and I remember this word for some reason. "Debbie, this was your mom's house. I can still see her everywhere I look. I can feel her all over the whole property. I'm not giving this house up." And then Deb moved her hand from his arm to his hand and told him we weren't leaving him alone. If he was staying, then we were too. And I guess good old Jim knew that Deb got her stubbornness from him, and he just nodded, accepting it. Looks like we're all staying in a house that might as well have been a to-go box as far as I was concerned. Jim said nobody was going outside then, something I was perfectly fine with. I had no intentions of wandering around outside after seeing what I did, especially after the sun went down. Debbie was the only one that slept that night. I remember lying there on my back in the bed next to her, still thinking about what I saw, trying to comprehend that there's more out there than we can accept as an educated human being. But what else was I thinking about? It was, if all these stories of the beasts of Bray Road were true, then what the hell else is out there too? Sasquatch, aliens, haunted houses? Because now I was sure as hell a believer in Dogman. So I think, at some point, I had accepted that other things might need to be believed in too. It was 2:18 in the morning when I heard the footsteps on the roof that night. They were loud and heavy. Thing is though, I didn't hear nothing climb up there. I didn't hear anything land up there as if it had leapt up there. They sounded heavier than what I would make if it were me walking around. I knew it wasn't a bird or anything. It was that monster again. That fear was like nothing that I can explain. I shook Debbie and whispered her name, but she whispered back to me, "I'm awake. I hear it too." It didn't go on for long. Maybe 5 minutes or so, but it was enough to send all of us out into the hallway, huddling together, listening to whatever was up there walking around on the damn roof. It stopped for a minute, like maybe it was listening to us too. We were whispering in hushed voices about what to do, and we decided it best to just stay right there and be quiet. When this thing started up again, it sounded like it walked all the way down the roof to the other side of the house, turned around and walked all the way back. It wasn't continuous either. It would take a few steps, pause, and then take a couple more after a few seconds. After those 5 minutes or so, They stopped altogether. I didn't hear it moving around anymore, but we sure as hell didn't go to bed. We stayed up and listened, trying to figure out if it was still there. Now, call me crazy, but I really don't think it was a coincidence that on the same day I see a dogman moving around on our property, that something else that sounded just as big as that damn thing was walking around on the friggin' roof. I think it was the same damn thing. I think the dogman that I saw in the cornfield was the same thing walking around on the roof that night. Now, Jim and Deb had never seen it there before. Maybe this creature was just passing through. Maybe it was staking out its new territory. Maybe it was lost and just trying to figure out where to go. Maybe it wanted to see if we were a threat or easy prey. All of these things were flying through my mind the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a wink. Neither did Debbie or Jim. We just sat there, quiet, listening. None of us spoke the rest of the night. We just sat there and stared off into space, clutching the rifles that Jim had at his house. I'm sure the two of them were thinking about that thing just as much as me. I wanted to ask them what was on their minds, but I didn't want to break the silence. I think we all needed to be quiet to listen to that thing, just to make sure that it wasn't coming in. When morning finally came, it was me that went out to make sure everything was okay. I was so scared, I couldn't feel my lips. I know that's a weird thing to experience, but I remember it perfectly. I was so scared that my damn lips were numb. I burst through that front door and spun around to look at the roof. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything up there that was going to pounce on me or grab me and pull me up there to eat me. I ran around the house looking at the roof, rifle in my hand, but I didn't see anything. What I did see though was a broken tree. It was a little sapling, so not a big tree by any means, but it looked like something big had either ran into it and broke it or grabbed it and snapped it in half to get it out of its way. It was lying on the ground, just broken in half there. I went back inside and said the coast was clear, and I suggested to Jim that maybe we should get out of there for a couple of days and he can spend some time at our place. I think everything we experienced that last night rattled him. He was quiet and kind of shaky and just nodded his head at me. "I'll grab some things," he told me. As he walked into his room, he stopped and turned back to look at me. And in true Jim fashion, he told me it was only going to be for a couple of days, and after that, he was coming back home. "Ain't nothing running me off my home," he said. I couldn't help but smile at him. Even with the terror of the day before, he was still just as stubborn as he'd always been. They don't build them like they used to, do they? Tough as nails like him. I really admired the toughness he had, and the courage he was keeping up for his daughter's sake. Even as a grown woman, he still felt the need to teach her lessons and how to go through life. We drove to our place and stayed there for a few days. Deb and I both used some sick time to stay at home with Jim and keep him company. We talked about what we had experienced, but after a few days it just seemed to, fade away. It faded off like it was some kind of scary dream we all shared. I kept thinking about it, but I tried to push it out of my mind as best as I could. I knew what we saw and I'd accepted it, so why dwell on it? I wanted to be just as tough and fearless as Jim was being. After those few days were up, I guess Jim got homesick or stir crazy and said he was going home. Debbie told him to be careful, and he said he'd call and check in frequently. He promised we didn't have anything to worry about and that he wasn't doing anything stupid. And he was right. For a year and a half, nothing happened. We didn't experience anything again like that night. No dogman, nothing on the roof, no broken trees. But then, one day, we found Jim out in his cornfield, stiff as a board. The autopsy showed that he suffered a major heart attack. I don't know if it had anything to do with the dogman, or if it was just his time to go. What I do know is that we found him in almost the exact same area that I saw the beast of Bray Road that night. That could have been a coincidence, I guess, but After seeing what I did and experiencing what all three of us did, I have a hard time believing that anything is a coincidence anymore. Debbie and I married 7 years ago now, and we made sure that the ashes of both of her parents were there. Jim was really an inspiration to me. I have a tattoo across my heart that matches the same inscription I made sure that we had engraved on his urn. Tough as nails. I want to thank you for sharing our story, and I hope I never have to share another one with you again. In the mid-90s, when I was living in Kentucky. It happened so long ago, but the memory is still as fresh as if it only happened yesterday. My name is Andrew, but everyone just calls me Drew. When this encounter happened, it was during a bad time in my life. My wife and I were always fighting. We'd been married for 4 years. We were high school sweethearts, but life just wasn't like it used to be. It came to the point where we decided to get a divorce. During this time, we were still living together, although we were living in separate rooms. Anytime we were around each other was just very awkward, so when she was around and not at work, I'd drive off and find a spot to just read. I just didn't want to be in the same house as her because I didn't want things to devolve into a fight like they always did. Every time I'd go off, I'd try to find a new place to sit and read, try to relax around nature and take my mind off of everything. During this encounter, I ended up 25 minutes away from my house and about 2 miles off the main road by a field. It was 6 p.m. in June when this encounter happened. I was reading Of Mice and Men. I never read it in high school and decided to go give it a go. My windows were down. I was enjoying the animal sounds. And then everything just got real quiet. It didn't register at first, and it wasn't until I finished the chapter actually that I looked up and just noticed everything was dead silent. I did that stereotypical confused look around, and I'm sure I had that stereotypical confused look on my face. I shrugged and decided to go back to my book. I was about to look back down when I noticed this contrast in color in the field next to me. I squinted at this thing because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It looked like this huge wolf thing, like a werewolf. It was staring to the left of itself into the tree line. It looked like whatever it was staring at definitely had its interest. This thing, from what I could tell, was absolutely massive. The field at this point was that straw color with a bunch of dead bushes and weeds all over the place. This thing was much darker than that. It was almost jet black in color, and I think that contrast is what caught my attention in the first place. It was sitting kind of hunched down like a catcher playing baseball. It was crouching to where its paws were touching the ground, but it wasn't sitting like a normal wolf would. The way this thing was sitting was eerie because it looked almost human-like. It had a very human air to it. It had a long muzzle, just like a wolf, and these long, triangular-shaped ears on the top of its head. I couldn't see a tail or anything, but because this thing was crouching down, it looked like it had to be at least 4 feet tall. And that's just crouching down. I could only imagine at this point just how tall it was if it stood up. I got spooked, and I actually crouched down lower in my car. Like, that actually helps, right? I looked in the direction of this thing, trying to get a better look at what it was staring at. I looked off in the direction that it was staring at, but I couldn't see anything. But this dogman or werewolf was captivated. I stared at the posture again, trying to decide what type of creature this was. What type of creature would be crouching and squatting in a human-like position like that? Then I heard this horrible scream from inside the tree line. It sounded like those recordings of Bigfoot that you can hear on YouTube nowadays. My blood ran cold. I could actually feel my heart in my ears. Whatever it was in the tree line, that's what that dogman was staring at. Whatever was in that tree line wasn't something that I knew existed. And then this creature that I'd been watching lifted its head up and made that same scream. I swear, I could feel my fillings vibrate inside of my mouth. It was just that loud. I guess I must have screamed too, or yelled or something, This thing turned its head. Not its body, just its head. It snapped over to me, looking right in my direction. I'm pretty sure we locked eyes. At that point, I had tunnel vision. I was dizzy. I wanted to puke. And then this thing showed me teeth. But it didn't look like it was snarling at me. This thing was actually grinning at me. It was grinning at me just like a person would, but the look on this thing's face was evil. Like it was furious, but also like it was excited that I saw it, and that I was afraid of it. This thing got up on all fours and galloped off like a hyena or something. It had that kind of loping gait. It ran off into the tree line, just in the same spot that it was staring. I can only imagine what it was doing in there when it found whatever else was making that noise. Needless to say, I drove the hell off after that. I blew through stop signs, I sped, I never went back there. I never told my now ex-wife what happened, because I didn't want her to call me names. She wasn't a very nice person at this point in our lives. I knew she would call me crazy or tell me I was hallucinating and that I needed help, but I just didn't want to deal with that kind of ridicule. I had nightmares for weeks after that. Nightmares of these monster-sized wolves chasing me. They were chasing me through that field, or they were chasing me down the street by my house. They were coming into my home, trying to get me. I dreamt about them all the time. Eventually, though, I got over it. I found a new job in a new town and packed up my stuff and got ready to move out of our home. It was a few weeks after I got my new place that I saw another one of these things. I moved an hour away from my old home, and an hour and a half away from my sighting. At this point in my life, I was now on cloud 9. I had a new job, a new place, and I was far away from my ex-wife. I didn't think of my sighting much anymore, and when I did, I just pushed it out of my mind and thought to myself that it had to be some kind of animal that I just wasn't familiar with. I guess that was just my way of rationalizing with it and maybe protecting my psyche. Little did I know that I was going to have another sighting that was even more terrifying than the last one, and cemented the fact in my mind that there are things out there that people have no idea exist, and there's no way in hell you can explain what they are. When this sighting happened, I was coming home late from a friend's house one night. It was about 12:30. I was driving down this road that I have to take to get back to the town that I was living in. At this point, it was October, so it was colder, and it got dark earlier, and it was actually kind of foggy out that night. I was driving, listening to music, and minding my own business, thinking of how much I was going to hate myself at work the next day because I was going to be tired, when this gigantic creature on 2 legs ran out in front of my car. It was probably no more than 100 feet in front of me, and it was damn fast. Or maybe it just took massive steps and it made it seem fast. I honestly don't know. All I know is that it towered over my car. It had to be 8, hell, even maybe 9 feet tall. It had long, shaggy gray and tan fur with bits of black and brown in it. This was not the same creature that I saw all those months ago in the field. Again, I didn't see a tail, but I got more details from this creature than I did from the one I saw before it. Its hands were long, human-like, and looked like they could grab onto things. Its feet looked like wolf paws, only much, much larger. It had those canine-like legs, and its fur was matted in areas. It had a long muzzle, just like the other one, the same long pointed ears on the top of its head, too. It barely glanced at me as it ran across the road, but the lights of my headlight reflected off of its eyes, and it had that nighttime animal glow to it. They were also bright yellow in color. It had a black nose that looked wet, just like a dog's does. Its mouth was shut, but I can only imagine what the teeth looked like inside that monster's mouth, because there were canines that were sticking out of its lips and draping over the bottom jaw. When it ran, it moved its arms back and forth like somebody running, just like a human. Just like the previous animal that I saw, this thing was gigantic. But even more unnerving than that was the way that it moved. That first creature was crouching down like a human. This thing was running like a human. And I'm not just talking about how human-like these things are when I say they're terrifying. Yeah, that part sucks. But the sheer bulk of these creatures terrifies me too. These things are insanely tall. But as tall as they are, it doesn't beat how muscular these things are. This thing was big and beefy. It looked like a bodybuilder, like one of the really buff guys that you see in the Olympics. Obviously, the most terrifying part of the encounter was the fact that it was running on two legs. And when I say it was running on two legs, I don't mean it was awkwardly tumbling on two legs. I mean it looked like it knew what it was doing. It looked like it could get around on those legs with no problem. It ran off to the other side of the road and jumped down to the side into the darkness. Again, I yelled in fright and watched this thing disappear. I was terrified it was going to circle around and leap at me again. I don't know if it ran in front of me to try to make me crash, or if it ran in front of me because I startled it, or if it ran in front of me for some other reason. I just kept going. I didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I didn't slam on my brakes. I'd seen one of these things before, and I did not want to get a closer look at this thing. After I passed where this thing ran in front of me, I sped up, in fact. I was going dangerously fast until I reached town and had to abide by the speed limits because of the cops that were around. I did not sleep that night. I mean, how the hell could I? I was thinking to myself that I was pretty sure I just saw an actual werewolf. I took note of the moon, foolishly thinking that these creatures could actually be werewolves and that the moon had some kind of effect on them. But to my astonishment, the moon was about half full that night. What exactly was it that I saw then? The internet at this point wasn't exactly a thing, so I couldn't just hop online and type in, "I think I just saw a real werewolf. What was it that I saw?" After that, I had enough of seeing these things around where I lived. I once again grabbed the papers and looked for another place to live. This time, I wasn't going to go to some podunk town that was surrounded by trees and woods and fields and monsters. The hell with that. I moved into the heart of Lexington, one of the biggest cities in Kentucky. Yes, I know there's still areas in Lexington where Dogman can go, but where I'm at, it's a busy, very populated area. I do not intend on ever going anywhere isolated enough to see one of these creatures again. These encounters changed my life. I fear the woods now. Before, I liked to go out there and read. Now, I don't want anything to do with them. I don't ever want to see one of these creatures again. I know what I saw was a dogman, but I'm still not convinced I actually know what a dogman is. Like, where do they come from? What do they want? I don't know if you have the answers I'm looking for. Maybe somebody on your channel does. Hopefully somebody will respond to you, and you can email me back with the questions that I have. The most prominent question I have is, why did I see these things twice? Was I just at the wrong place at the wrong time, 2 different times? Or did I see them for another reason? I listened to all the Dogman stories on your channel, and your old channel, and a lot of other channels. And there was one that talked about a man that thought the Dogman sought him out because of his DNA. I pray to God that that's not the reason that I saw them. I'm hoping that I really was just at the wrong place at the wrong time twice. Anyways, best regards, Drew. Two years ago in Minnesota, in November, during the first day of deer season, I went out and sat in a tree stand in the early morning with my shotgun. After a while, I heard growling and large footsteps, and at first I thought it was just a large coyote. But then this thing came out into the open, and I knew it was a creature that most people have never encountered, and even fewer believe to exist. It was 5 feet tall at the shoulder, and on all fours. The dark brown to almost black fur was shaggy, and I could see it blowing in the breeze. It was like a large dog, only its front paws were more like hands, and its tail was long like a cat's tail. As it growled at me, I could see its teeth. They were almost the same size as my shotgun shells, which were 2.5 inches long. I wished I had that shotgun with me. I watched it come my way, and I realized that it was following my scent. I was scared shitless. I'd never been so scared in my life. I didn't even know what the hell this thing was that I was about to go up against. And I definitely did not want to die. So I raised my rifle and pushed the safety forward. When it clicked, the animal looked straight at me and started to come right towards the tree that I was in. I did the only thing I could think of. I shot 3 times. The first 2 hit a tree behind it, but the third hit it in the chest, as far as I could tell anyway. All it did, though, was stumble, and then turn and run back into the thick brush nearby. I was so scared that it might still be out there that I stayed in the stand for 3 hours. At noon or so, I decided to make a run to the truck, and when I got to where it'd been hit, I only found a little bit of blood, like the bullet didn't even go through the skin. That blood was so dark red that it was almost black. And for whatever reason, that blood smelled horrible. I ran to my truck after that. Later that year, I was trapping when I saw what I assumed were these things' tracks next to a destroyed trap and a bunch of blood and fur from a raccoon. Or, at least what I think used to be a raccoon. After that, I never went back into those woods. I will never go back into those woods. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share my story and let people know that when they hear the existence of monsters, they should believe it. I don't know everything that's out there, but I do know that Dogman is out there. A little bit about myself before I get into my encounter. My name's Benjamin. I'm 51 years old. I run a garage in Washington. I've been happily married to my lady love since 1988, and we have 2 beautiful daughters, Ashley and Megan. We're a hunting family, born and raised. A good season feeds us a long time. This happened in Washington, although I've been advised not to give the exact location. It was in 2004. I was with both of my daughters on a hunting trip when it happened. We'd been out for 2 hours and were having a good father-daughter day. The air was cool and crisp. The sun was bright and it was looking to be a really good day. Ashley was 14 and Megan was 11. Ashley had been coming out with me for 3 years now, and Megan was starting her 2nd year out there in the woods with us. All of a sudden, the forest got real quiet-like. I mean, not an animal was making any noise in our vicinity. Not even the bugs. If you've ever been out in the woods, you know that it's loud, chock full of animals, but on this day, at this time, nothing was making a peep. Until we heard this deep growling. Like something was mad that we were there, or something was very, very territorial. Automatically, I decided it was time to get out of that area. I needed to protect my girls, although they weren't as frightened as me. I guess you could call it the ignorance of their youth, or the fact that they were and still are to this day pretty fearless. The whole day, the forest had this unnatural calm to it. There were no deer at all. Not a doe, not a buck. It happens sometimes. Sometimes you just have a bad day and can't take any game. About another hour went by, and I was making comments about how calm the forest was, and how we didn't see any animals at all. We decided to just start wandering around, taking a hike instead of pursuing our hunting day. We stayed on the trails after that, so we didn't stumble on anything else out there hunting. I still had that growling in the back of my mind, but we were pretty far off from that area now, so I just kept my eyes on the area and my hand on my gun. We wandered around for a while and ended up sitting on this big rock formation to eat lunch. I was joking with them about boys, and they were insisting that boys were gross. I wasn't about to argue with them. The thing you need to know about my girls is I raised 2 strong, intelligent, independent, beautiful women, and even back then, they had this independence that I didn't achieve until I was an adult. Megan then pointed out a spike running down a hill. If you don't know what a spike is, it's a young buck. It has antlers, but it's still just a juvenile, so they're illegal to hunt. Now this spike was hauling ass, like the devil was chasing it. There was definitely something big chasing it behind it, but at first I couldn't see it. All 3 of us stood and looked at this thing. Whatever it was, broke out of the tree line. "What in the hell is that?" I said out loud to the girls. This thing looked like a giant wolf, but there's no wolves that big around here. In fact, I don't think there's wolves that big anywhere. Now, this thing was running on all fours, but I estimated it, and I'm a pretty good judge at this type of thing. It had to be 800 pounds. It stood probably 4.5 feet tall on all fours. It was a dark brown like Hershey's color. It had long, shaggy hair and a long tail. It was flopping around behind it, and it was giving chase to this poor deer. We got a pretty good look at this thing. We weren't actually that far away, just up on the other side of the hill, and this thing was in a little clearing in a valley. It had a long muzzle, and its mouth was wide open like it was breathing heavy, and you could see these giant teeth in its mouth, and its tongue flopped out on one side. It had long pointed ears. It was extremely muscular, like the bulk of a grizzly bear, only the muzzle of this thing didn't match a bear. Bears usually have that shorter type of muzzle compared to canines. This creature was definitely a canine type animal. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that the thing we were staring at was an honest-to-God werewolf. I know better now, but that's what I thought back then. We continued to watch as this thing pounced and tackled that poor Spike. It grabbed onto it with claws, or, at this point, I should just start describing them as hands, because wolves don't grab on the way this thing did. This thing was definitely not a wolf. It didn't use its teeth at first. It grabbed this Spike and tackled it to the ground. It used one claw to pin that poor thing to the ground, and then it used its other claw to rip into it, tearing into the chest and neck of that poor animal. The death cries from that poor Spike are something that I will never ever forget. My girls and I watched in awe of this creature. I wasn't too scared at this point. I wasn't as nervous as I was about to be, because we were still covered by the trees, and although this thing was pretty close to us, it was far enough away to where we could get out of there if we needed to. And of course, it was busy destroying that Spike. And then, I'll be damned if this werewolf, dogman, whatever you call it, didn't stand up on its hind legs just like a man does. Now I put this thing at 8 feet tall, easy. Running on all fours, I could tell this thing was massive, but when it stood up on those two hind legs, the sheer size of this thing made me swallow hard, and spit got caught in the middle of my throat. This thing put any bodybuilder to shame. It was enormous. The arms of this thing were gigantic. The legs were powerful and looked like it could easily be able to support itself on hind legs as it ran as fast as it could on four legs. But the thing that gets me was the anatomy of its arms, because they just looked so damn human-like. It had a wrist. It had an elbow. Those elbows moved back and forth like a man would. And the legs had that appearance of how the dogs and the wolves stand on their toes, so it gives the appearance that their legs are facing backwards when in reality it's just their ankle. But the way it stood was just too human-like. To this day, I honestly do think it could have been a werewolf. But from what I heard, dogmen and werewolves are different. And the tail I saw makes it a dogman. Now I don't really know what a dogman is, but if it's anything like a werewolf, then I guess I consider them one and the same. You could see the muzzle as it lifted its head up and made this deep, screaming roar, like it was satisfied that it had killed that Spike. Then the scariest thing happened. I heard another call from back up the hill where this thing came from. And that call sounded just as big and just as mean as this other creature that we were looking at down there. It seemed to me like they were communicating with each other. And now, I was scared. In fact, I was downright terrified. If there's two of these things, who's to say there's not more? Who's to say they're not spread out across this forest, hunting in a pack like a wolf does? This thing looks like a wolf, and I know that wolves hunt in packs. They don't just hunt in pairs, so how many of those things could be out there in the forest waiting for the call of this other one, saying that it scored a meal? That's when I grabbed my girls and got the hell out of there. I've never gone through the woods so fast or so scared. I just wanted to get my girls to safety. We needed to get back to the Bronco, and we needed to get back home. We needed to get the hell out of those woods. When we got home, I reported it. I told the local wildlife officials that I saw something that looked god-awful lot like a werewolf. They told me it was probably a bear, but I told them otherwise. Here's the thing. I reported it. They took my description. They told me they'd get back in touch with me, but I never heard back from them. I think they covered it up. Or maybe they went out and took care of it without telling me what was going on. I still hunt. I still go in the woods and I still get my game, but now I also pack a shotgun, just in case. It might not do anything at a distance, but if one of those things comes close, there's nothing that can take a shotgun point blank. Right? The day I saw that thing, I'd never been so scared in my life. The girls, they were scared too, but they just have this strength that I can't comprehend. They must get it from their mother. They were more nervous and anxious to get out of there than they were terrified like me. I don't think they were fearing for their safety like I was fearing for theirs. That was so long ago now. Almost 20 years. I can still remember every detail of that day though. Both my girls are grown up. They're married and made me a grandpa to a couple of grandchildren that I absolutely love. We teach them about hunting, but now we also teach them that there's things out in the forest that most people don't believe in, and that even more people can't comprehend. They know to be safe. They know to never go out there alone. Hell, I never go out there alone. If you do, you might run into one of those things. I used to work about 30 miles away from where I lived. One night, I'd been stuck in heavy traffic coming home. I take Lasix, a diuretic, so after a while, I really had to go to the bathroom. I kept telling myself I was almost home and tried to hold it until I got there, but by the time I got to my exit, I knew I wasn't going to make it to my house. I pulled up to an area where Fidelity Investments is located and found an area that was isolated. This area is heavily wooded, with walking trails and a lot of game, but it's also a very populated area. I pulled up to a little side drive off of one of the main roads. That little drive is about 100 feet long, and there's only room for one car at a time. It went up in elevation and had bushes on the right side facing the main road. On the left side, there was a guardrail and a view of the valley below. The area up there is huge and isolated with several buildings that are all spaced out. The place is dark at night because there's only intermittent streetlights up there. At night, it's also pretty deserted too. A few cars go through that area though because it's a shortcut people use to go from Taylor Mill over to the highway. There are stores and restaurants. When you're up there, you're also above everything else. When I stopped, I got out of my car and waited a moment and looked around to make sure there were no other cars. It was winter when this happened, so the bushes between where I was and the road didn't have many leaves on them, and because of that, you could see right through them. I was up on a little rise about 20 or 30 feet above the drive. I went to the back of my car and did what I had to do, and when I finished, I stood up, and all at once, every hair on my body stood up. For some reason, my instincts kicked in, and I knew that I wasn't alone. I scanned the area in front of me, and must have heard something behind me because I turned around to where there were 3 deer standing there all huddled up together between my car and the guardrail. This was weird because normally they don't approach people, but they didn't seem afraid of me. And they weren't looking at me either. They were looking across the road, and I looked back over there too to see what they were looking at. And that's when I saw this huge figure standing between the bushes in front of it and the trees behind it. I stand 5'5", and some of those bushes were about 6 feet tall, but they only came up to about the collarbone area of this thing. Due to the streetlights to the right, about 20 feet away, I was able to get a pretty clean outline of this thing. It had a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. I couldn't make out its neck, but I could make out these massive shoulders. And that's when this thing growled. It was a deeper vibration than anything I've ever felt. I could feel this vibration in my chest, and then my body just took over at that point. So I have to explain this part to you so you understand. I worked security for years in California, in the music business. As a woman, I have to really work out and train to defend myself. I kickboxed for 8 years and worked out every day. I also had years of training in dogs, mainly Anatolian Shepherds and German Shepherds, and sometimes I had to establish that I was the alpha and make them understand that they have to listen to what I say. To do that, I have to get them down, hold them in place, sometimes grab them by their ears and growl until they submit, and then the training can start. So when this thing growled at me, I guess it was just pure instinct. I dropped down into a crouching position and growled back. When I did, it stopped. The growling stopped. It looked at me with this odd expression on its face, and it started sniffing the air. Its nose went up, and it turned its head slightly as it was sniffing around, and then it took a few steps forward. I was still crouched down on all fours, and I moved towards it, still growling at that thing. When I did that, it stopped. I stood up and kept staring at it. I never broke eye contact with it. Then it slowly stepped back into the tree line until I couldn't make it out as clearly as before, and it started to move to the right of me. The deer were still behind me. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them. It was like they knew that it would come after me before it came after them or something, and it was using me as a way to keep themselves protected. I waved my arms and told them to get out of there, and when I did that, they leapt back over the guardrail and took off down the hill. That's when I jumped in my car and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I honestly felt like this thing was trying to circle behind me, and I wasn't going to wait around for that. Do I think I scared it? No, of course not. That thing could have swatted my head clean off of my shoulders, but I do think I confused it for a couple of minutes, and that gave me time to move. I told my husband about what had happened up there, but I didn't tell him exactly what I saw because he'd think I was nuts. And to be honest, I thought I was a little crazy myself, until I saw a picture of a Dogman. I know there are other things in this world that can't be explained. I've seen them too, but this was beyond any of those things. The fear that this thing causes is crazy. It's unnatural fear. This primal, guttural fear that you just know something is wrong, even before you see this thing. It's like your body can sense it, and it reacts to that. Since that sighting happened, I can't take that shortcut through that area anymore. My husband took me back over there one time, and I was begging him to get me out of there the whole time. Honestly, I thought I was going to throw up. And the wildlife there has almost completely disappeared too. From what I know, nobody else has saw anything up there. Or at least, nobody's talking about a big wolf-like creature that walks around on 2 legs that could have chased them out of that area. I know that I keep my mouth shut because I don't want to be ridiculed, so maybe other people feel the same way. The street I live on is only about 1 mile or so down the hill from this place, and lately, we've seen coyotes on the streets, like they've been chased out of the area that they used to hunt. Pets here have started to go missing too, and a lot of people here have also seen a black figure moving through our backyards. Whatever this thing is, nobody's really got a good picture of it yet. It sticks to the shadows, but whatever it is massive and dark. Down here, the dogs throughout the neighborhood go crazy, regularly, always at night. And now, people are calling the cops when they see that large black figure jumping over fences. I'm not talking about climbing over them or hopping over them like a person. I'm talking about leaping over 6-foot fences and clearing them without a problem. My concern is that the thing that I saw up there has come down the hill after eating everything up there, and now it's looking for somewhere else to feed. God help us. I work as a wildlife official for an area called the Land Between the Lakes. Yes, I have heard of the infamous Dogman attacks there, but no, I have not seen one myself. I did come across the campsite one time of people that I do believe in my heart of hearts was the result of a Dogman attack. I'm sorry that I have to be vague about this encounter, but since it's all still considered an open crime investigation, I cannot give too many details. But here's what happened one day. I was on my normal shift and came across this abandoned campsite. They weren't really supposed to be in that area anyway, so I stopped to take a look around. The first thing I noticed was that everything was still there. We're talking coolers, tents, personal possessions, even the vehicles. The next thing I noticed was the state of the tent. One side was completely ripped open. It looked like somebody took a razor blade or a knife and just shredded the hell out of that side of it. There were blood trails. Not a lot, but enough to make me worry. I called around the area, identified myself as an official, and searched the basic perimeter, but I couldn't find or hear anybody. I called in for backup and gave them the coordinates, and I waited for them to get there. While I waited, I searched more through the possessions and found 2 wallets. One for a man and one for a woman. So at least we had names of the people that were missing. And like I said before, I'm sorry, but I can't give out that information. When my backup got there, we noticed these big scuffle marks that looked like somebody or something might have been dragged away from the area. And we also noticed these very large footprints that looked like they could have very well been canine. We took samples of the blood and called in for more backup so we could do a missing person search and looked around the area. We searched the rest of the day in the surrounding wooded area for the people that were missing. That night we got into contact with their families to see if they'd come home, but they hadn't. We took samples of everything we saw there, including the blood trails that we saw, and we took pictures of the footprints and the scuffle marks. I took pictures of the state of the tent, and we took back the IDs of the people so we could keep on investigating. That night, we went back defeated when it started to get dark. But we set out to search the next day at dawn, with even more wardens, volunteers, and police officials. We all combed through the area, but we still found nothing. After a few days of searching, I was actually contacted by my boss, and I was told that this case was now deemed classified by people that he had to answer to, and I was actually supposed to cease all search efforts. It really chapped my hide that I had to stop searching for these missing people, and I knew in my heart of hearts that something fishy was going on. Why the hell would these people that my boss answers to turn away help when the woods were so vast? That was 2 years ago, and those people have still not been found. It's not a closed case at all. I don't know what's out there, and I don't know what they were attacked by, but it makes you wonder, considering all of the local lore. What if it was in fact the beast of the land between the lakes that attacked these people? My name is Yona, and I live in Delhi, India. A couple of months ago, my best friend Varuna and I were sitting in our room studying for our upcoming finals. With only a couple of weeks left, we were super stressed and stayed up for hours at night to prepare. This was our college graduation exam, and we both were pursuing the same subject, living in the same apartment complex and going to the same college. I've known her since we were kids. We met during our kindergarten year, so we were very close. So, that night was yet another night of preparation, and we're sitting in our living room, studying as usual. Our apartment is on the 5th floor, which faces this part of the land that's empty, but huge. The only trees present on that land are big coconut trees. The ground is full of tall grasses, which cover up the land. There's a huge pond in the middle of it as well. When we first moved in, that piece of land was seriously spooky because there were no houses, and it was full of foxes that lived there. Every night they'd start barking and howling, which was scary at first, but with time we both grew used to it. To separate the land from our complex, there's a huge 6-foot wall which prevents the foxes from coming in. From our living room terrace, we can see the foxes running around looking for food. At this point, it was around 2:30 a.m., and Varuna and I were chugging coffee and quizzing each other. The foxes started howling and barking, but we didn't pay any attention. They did this at intervals every night, so it was nothing new. However, this time, they did not stop barking. Usually, they'd stop barking after a couple of minutes, but they were at it for a really long time for some reason. The complex is new here, and not many people live here yet, so there's no noise, and the street is far away, so no noise from vehicles can be heard either. So this night, their continuous barking really irked us because we were trying to concentrate. To make matters worse, the stray dogs that lived in our complex started barking as well. Our complex is full of them because it's still under construction and they get a lot of food from the workers and the few people that live here. We have 2 Labrador retrievers as well, Danny and Drogo. Yes, we named them because we love Daenerys and her call. They rushed to the terrace, and their back hair was standing up. We didn't pay them any attention, but after a while, we went to the terrace to bring them back in before they started barking like crazy. Varuna went with me, and we could hear the rustling of the grass, which made us look out towards the field. At first, we saw a few foxes running around, and then suddenly, this huge shape got up from the ground. Honestly, I thought it was a person at first, but when it stood up, it was holding what looked like a dead fox in its mouth. We stood there looking at it without making any sound, and that's when our dogs decided to empty their lungs at this thing. Well, that thing turned and glanced at us, and I could see it had a long snout, shabby, rusty gray hair, and pointed ears. Its eyes held such a malicious look that honestly, I thought it was peering into my soul. And the eyes were this silvery color. It looked like it was breathing heavily and growling at the same time, as it now held the dead fox in one really long, clawed hand. Is that a werewolf? Varuna screeched beside me and dug her nails into my arm, breaking my shock. Then the thing turned, got down on the ground and started running. We could see it going farther away as it broke the grass and trampled on it, running at full speed. And honestly, it was faster than anything I've ever seen. We stood there, still in shock, staring into a now empty field, trying to figure out what the hell it was that we had just seen. The dogs had stopped barking, and were now nuzzling my leg to get attention. Slowly I turned and went in. Varuna followed behind me, and locked the terrace door. We went to the rooms and started closing the windows and pulling the curtains. I have never been so scared in my entire life. Even though we saw it run away, we were sure it would come back. We switched off the lights and sat on our sofa not saying anything. We could still hear the distant barking and howling of the foxes, but it faded away after a while. We fell asleep on the couch that night and woke up late. Varuna was still shaken up and wanted to go investigate, but I shot down that idea. I mean, it sounded like suicide to me. What if that thing came back? We waited for 2 weeks to see if it would come back, but it never did. And personally, I'm glad that it never came back. I don't know what it was. I don't believe in things like werewolves, but honestly, after seeing that thing, I have no other explanation because it looked like a werewolf. It moved like a werewolf. If it wasn't, what else could it be? This story takes place in Covina, California, which is 20 minutes east of Los Angeles and 20 minutes south of the Azusa Canyons in the San Gabriel Valley mountain range. This story spans from when I was just 5 years old until recently. My first sighting was when I was 5 years old. I was lying in bed one night during a heavy rainstorm, and my father was in the living room catching some late-night TV. I remember minding my own business, when suddenly my bedroom window shattered into a million tiny pieces. I don't remember much, besides running out of the room and screaming for my mother and father, but years later they would tell me that I was screaming, "Werewolf! Werewolf!" How creepy's that, right? Well, I would end up recovering some of these memories around the time I was 29 years old. It was after a very vivid nightmare that I woke up in sweat with these images in my head that were just too vivid. I remember seeing it through the shattered window, standing higher than the eaves of our house. This thing had to crouch down to look at me through the window frame because it was so damn tall. It had these long, pointed ears and a muscular build concealed by thick fur and long, sharp teeth. 10 years later, at the age of 15, I was lying in bed. Now this would have been back in the 90s, before wireless headphones and Bluetooth were even a thing. My wired headphones couldn't reach my bed, so I got bundled up on the floor so I could listen to music while I went to sleep. Keep in mind, too, that my window was always kept about 4 inches open. This was because I just enjoyed the night air, no other reason. Our home was one story. My room was on the ground level, obviously, and the view of it was of the front lawn. I started to fall asleep, so I removed the headphones. At the moment I did, my eyes shot wide open, and my heart began to pound as I had this feeling of terror just come over me out of nowhere. And that's when I began to hear the sounds of clicking claws on hard wood, like something was racing across the front porch. Whatever it was coming fast, and it sounded like it was on all fours. I could then hear it enter the yard, walking around on the grass and dirt. And it was then that the sounds of the footsteps changed. They were less frequent, as if whatever it was pivoted from walking on four legs to two. But whatever this thing was still sounded so heavy that every footstep sort of shook the window pane. It slowed down to almost a standstill in front of my window. I could hear its heavy, slow breathing. It sounded absolutely huge, and I got the strong feeling that if I looked over at it past the blinds and witnessed this thing for myself, that it would have the license or permission to come inside and take me. Now, my grandmother's room was down the hall. She was all into gods and angels and stuff. I wasn't, but I felt that if I could just be in her presence, that I'd be safe from this thing. So I swallowed hard, took a big deep breath, and bolted out of my room. I ran down the hall, moving faster than I ever had. I wanted to make it to my grandmother's room, into that safety. But about halfway there, I stood frozen. My heart was pounding out of my chest still, but I didn't hear anything come through my window. So I waited for a moment or two before slowly and quietly making my way back to my room. Seeing that whatever was out the window was no longer there, I stayed up all that night, called my friend and told her about the events that just took place. Nothing else would happen until about a year after that, and it was around the same season the previous encounter happened. It happened again, and went down almost the exact same way as I was bundled up on the floor. The window was cracked open, my headphones were in, and something stopped at my window, letting me hear it, walk around and breathe. Like it was doing it on purpose. Whatever it was wanted me to know that it was there. Once again, I ran to my grandmother's room, but nothing would be at my window when I went back. Another year passed, and again about the same season, I had yet another encounter. But this time, I remembered the last 2 years, so I immediately closed my window when I heard his claws clacking. I was in bed this time, not on the floor, and later that night I woke up to sounds of thuds. It sounded like those heavy footsteps again, this time more deliberate, as if it was trying to wake me up and get my attention. The following morning, I ran to my window, only to find my window screen clawed in half from one side to the next. I was horrified. This was the first time since my childhood encounter that it tried to get in. All I could think about was that nightmare and those memories that the nightmare brought back. Was I really being stalked by a werewolf every single year? 3 years later, I was working at a warehouse job. I worked the swing shift and wouldn't get home until 1:30. That particular night, I came home and went back into the backyard to unwind. I enjoyed the late night air and the view of the trees and the wind. And at this point, nothing had happened for 3 years, so I guess I just didn't think about it anymore. Anyway, I went out the back door to sit on the porch, and I looked out at the tool shed nearby, only to find 2 green reflecting eyes staring at me. The moment I saw them, my heart seemed to stop. So did my breathing. I thought about those things again. All those encounters. I thought that I must have been seeing something, though, so I quickly backed onto the porch to where I could no longer see the glowing green eyes. But I stepped forward again to see if they were still there. They were. Not only that, they were following my every footstep for as long as they could see me. When they blinked, I got this strong feeling that I needed to get back inside, so I did so immediately. That was the last time I saw anything for 20 years. And then, one night, I was out in my backyard again, when out of nowhere, I smelled the strong stench of body odor. I couldn't locate where it was coming from. I was sitting alone at the time, and I knew it wasn't me. It wasn't long after noticing that odor that there was this long, low, guttural growling noise. It sounded far off, but close at the same time, I guess. It's hard to explain. It was a growl that I've never heard anything make before. We had a bunch of storage boxes on the patio at the time, and I was on the other side of those boxes. That thing sounded like it was sort of on the other side. I didn't wait around to see where it was or what it was. I bolted inside immediately, leaving my phone charger, backpack, and vape pen. I didn't go back out there until the daylight. The funny thing is, though, that this really got me into researching and reading about werewolves, because every time I had an encounter like this, I would go back to thinking about those dreams and that encounter I had when I was 5. At one point, I found a passage that read that the transition from man to wolf can only occur once a year. This was really creepy for me to read because those first 3 experiences all happened to me around the same season of the year, like clockwork. It was a hard realization to come to, but I really do think that these creatures exist. I grew up on a ranch. It was just like something out of an old cowboy movie, and I loved it. It was like a dream childhood, and I always felt comfortable with the horses. They were kind and gentle creatures, and extremely loyal and protective. I never felt afraid when I was there, and I never left. Other kids in town went off to college and moved away. I just always felt safe, happy, secure, and fulfilled with my horses. It made what happened when I saw him all the more frightening, though. At this point, even though my parents were both still alive and well, they were getting on a bit, and I had more or less taken over the entire day-to-day management of the ranch, allowing them to just enjoy being there and kind of retire for the most part. At the time, we had 10 horses, most of them having been there for several years. But my absolute favorite of all of them was a mare named Sandy. And at that point, I was taking extra special care of her, because at the time she was pregnant. At first, when I heard all the neighing and stumping around that night, I actually thought that Sandy might be in labor, so I hurried out to the stables. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning. When I got there, I found that she was fine, and there were no signs of her starting her journey into becoming a mother. But the others were just acting strange. They were acting as though something had tried to get into the stables, and they were all huddled at the backs of their stalls, spooked, and trying to get as far away as possible from the opening of the barn. Now, we do get the occasional coyote sniffing around sometimes, and with a baby on the way, I knew I needed to be extra vigilant, so I kept the main barn doors closed to keep them safe inside, and decided to just do a quick check, just to be safe. Not before grabbing my shotgun, though. I never had to kill one of these coyotes, and usually a warning shot was enough for them to run away, and as soon as I got closer to the fencing that surrounds the property and leads out towards this huge forest, I just began to feel extremely uncomfortable. My blood ran cold for some reason, and I could feel my heart beat faster and my breath catch. I could genuinely feel something watching me. Now, I didn't want to fire off a shot unless I had to, since the horses were already spooked and just starting to calm down. Besides, just because I could feel something watching me doesn't necessarily mean there was something there. Like I said, it was the middle of the night. I was out there all alone. It could have just been my imagination. Maybe the anxiety from all the stables was just getting to me. I checked all around where the coyotes usually try to get in, but there was nothing around the fence. Having been focused on looking on the ground, when I finally looked up and towards the trees behind the property, I screamed. I might as well have shot off several rounds of the gun, because that's practically how loud I was screaming, because standing there, on the other side of the fence, I could just make out the shadow of a shape of a very tall creature. This creature was very humanoid. It had 2 straight glowing amber eyes, and it was watching me, scanning around, checking me out. My first thought was that it was a very tall person, but in a split second my brain rationalized that this was not a person at all. Whatever this was far more terrifying. Shooting at a coyote was one thing, and I genuinely wasn't sure if I could shoot a person, though this thing was not a person at all. It didn't seem to be moving any closer, just standing there, observing, like it was playing a game of chess or something. This thing was observing, taking the time to take in the situation and make strategic moves. Due to how dark it was, I could only make out the outline of the body and the eyes when they emitted a very low, rumbling growl. I couldn't hear or see anything aside from this except for the horses. The shadow seemed to move a little, and then I heard a couple of barks. By now, I was so genuinely freaked out, the only thing I could think of was aiming the gun and firing off a warning shot. That's when there was about a split second of light, and I screamed again, as now I saw the outline of what I thought was originally a man, because although the body looked relatively human, the head was more like that of a dog. It screamed at me, a loud, horrible, rumbling scream. Then it shot down to all fours like an animal and ran off faster than I've ever seen anything move in my entire life. I genuinely don't even think I've ever been so terrified. When it ran away, it began crashing through the tree line. In the trees, I could hear it moving. It was heavy and strong. It sounded like if you took 20 linebackers and had them run at full speed into the forest. It was so loud. I ran back to the stables and stayed there with the horses all night, my gun in hand. I tried to reassure them with my presence. The next day, Sandy gave birth, and I continued to sleep in the stables with them for the coming weeks. I don't know what that thing was, but if that thing had come for Sandy, she'd be gone, and I wasn't going to take any chances with her future. Thankfully, I've seen nothing of it since. I don't know if it was passing through, or if it realized that I wasn't one to mess with, or if it just didn't see us as anything more than a waste of time. But whatever it was, it's like nothing I've ever seen in my entire life. This creature shouldn't be here, yet I came face to face with it. I still don't know what it was that I saw. I've read a lot about Dogman, I've read a lot about werewolves. I don't know if it was one of those, or if it was something else. I was so freaked out I didn't get a good look at its backside, so I don't know if there was a tail or not. But I do know this thing moved lightning quick, and it was bigger than anything I'd ever seen in my entire life. It was definitely something supernatural, and I'm glad I've never seen anything like it since. My encounter was about 23 years ago. My oldest daughter was 3 at the time. I'd go hiking when her dad would come get her for the day. Me and a friend of mine went out to a nature walk outside the city we lived in Texas. It was a lovely place with lots of trees and animals and butterflies. We'd seen lots of animals there at times. Deer, a coyote or two, skunks, and once a mountain lion at a distance. We got to the nature walk, parked, and started off down the path. It was a nice sunny Sunday afternoon, and we took our time walking down the path. The first part is through a clearing, then goes into trees, which gets denser as you go further. At one point, the part goes off to the left to a small bridge over a dried riverbed, and we always took the path over the bridge. It circled around and went back to the original path eventually, so it was easier to just stay on this. This day, we were standing on the bridge, my friend about in the middle and myself on the further side. The bridge was about 20 yards long, so we weren't far apart. As we were standing there, I heard what sounded like someone stomping through the trees and coming towards us pretty quickly. I glanced over to where we heard the noise but saw nothing. I asked my friend if she saw anyone, and she said no. I'm about 5'3", and my friend is 6'2", so she could get a lot better of a glance around there than I could. And I was just concerned that somebody was coming up on us since we were 2 women walking alone in the middle of nowhere. After a few minutes of hearing the stomping and watching where it sounded like it was coming from, I finally saw a dark shape. And about that time, this thing stopped moving. I kept looking and asking my friend if she could tell me what it was. As I looked more, I started to think that it looked like a person with a dog head or a big dog mask, maybe somebody trying to scare us. But then I saw this really tall, large person with a dog head. It was not a mask. As I looked more, I saw it swing its head towards us and away, and I saw the long nose and large pointy ears. I could see how the wind blew its long dark hair and realized that this thing was covered in that same coarse hair. If this was a person in a costume, then it was a pretty damn convincing costume. At that point, I thought I had to be crazy because I was sure I was looking at a real werewolf, and I was certain that they weren't real. But whatever this thing was, whatever this creature was that I was standing there staring at, was very, very real. And I got a really good look at it. I could see its yellowish eyes as it would swing its head towards us and then away, like it was watching us and something else off in the other direction. I was so sure that I was going to die that day. I knew I'd never see my daughter again, and maybe nobody would even find our bodies. Whatever this thing was just filled me with this sense of terror. I was beyond terrified. I grabbed the back of my friend's shirt and said, "Do you see it? Do you see it?" over and over and over. I grabbed a large tree branch with my other hand. She said, "Yes, I see it. What the hell is it?" We just stood there on that bridge watching it while it watched us. It seemed like forever that we were standing there, and it suddenly took off the way that it came. I think it was going after whatever the hell else it was watching the other way. I just kept saying, "Do you see it?" over and over, even after that. After about 5 minutes, my friend said, "Let's see if we can get to the car." So we slowly took off back up the path towards the car. At one point on the trail, there's large bushes on either side, and you can't see around. I was afraid to walk by because I just knew that that thing was on the other side waiting to pounce on us. Eventually, though, we went by and we got to the car. My friend had to pry my hand off of her shirt and unlock the car and shove me inside. Once inside the car, we locked the doors, and I started to cry. I was so scared. My friend finally started the car, and we took off down the road as fast as we felt safe going. When we put some distance between us and whatever the hell that thing was, we pulled over and hugged each other to comfort each other. I was so sure I was going to die that day. And at that point I realized I still had the tree branch in my hand too. We never went back there. I hadn't heard of a Dogman back then, but I'm fairly certain that's what we saw that day. I feel lucky to have gotten out of there unhurt and alive. I don't know what else it was looking at. I hope it wasn't some other person. Hopefully it was just one of those deer that we see. As messed up as it sounds that this thing attacked and killed a deer, I think it would have been a lot more tragic if it had gotten a hold of a person. I don't know if they eat people or if they just watch them like it watched us. I hope it's the latter, because if there's something like that out there and it's preying on people, then we are not as high on the food chain as we thought. A couple of years back, my friend Jack and I went on a road trip starting out in Boise, Idaho, and ending at my relative's house in Michigan. We would stay there for a couple of weeks before heading home again. We took it slow, stopping at all sorts of oddball roadside attractions and campsites before we found my cousin's house. Once there, we passed the time normally swimming, playing with my cousin's kids, taking hikes, and holding bonfires. One night, Jack suggested we go on a night hike to get some peace away from the noise and clutter of the house. The opportunity to knock back a couple of beers in silence sounded perfect to me. It was a perfect summer night after all. The crickets and fireflies were out in full force, and I was in the mood to goof around in the woods, so I readily agreed. We set off around 11 o'clock, hefting a bag chock full of the finest junk food and beer courtesy of my cousin's pantry and fridge. We hiked along the trail. We talked and joked without any concern for how loud we were being. After all, we knew we were alone in the woods. It was just us, some beer, and some squirrels. Nothing dangerous was living out here near my cousins. Or, at least, we thought so. As we continued down the trail, Jack came to a sudden halt. He turned around to look me in the eyes, and his eyes were wide open. He asked what was going on, and I asked him what was up. He said he saw some movement in the distance, and it looked like something big. I laughed at him, but he smacked my arm and told me that he was being completely serious, no joking. I told him that maybe it was a bear, and he should just relax. All we had to do was make some noise and keep a lookout, and it probably wouldn't come any closer. I promised him that everything was going to be fine. He looked skeptical, but began to walk on anyway. We kept on going down the trail, but as we rounded a bend up ahead, my blood went cold. Because there, in the middle of the trail ahead of us, stood this massive thing covered in thick black fur. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with a body like a man, and the head more akin to a wolf or maybe a German shepherd. It stared down at us, teeth bared in almost this sadistic grin. Jack and I glanced at each other briefly, and in that moment, we had one shared thought. Run. At the same time, Jack and I turned and bolted down the trail as fast as we possibly could, dropping all of the things that we were carrying. The creature gave chase though, and it was keeping pace with us easily, always at our side. Obviously, if this thing wanted to, it could leap out and take us, grab us at any second, period. We sprinted for what seemed like forever. We were out of breath and in pain, and I desperately wanted to drop to my knees, but I knew if I did, that would mean my end. Finally, we saw the trail. We ran through the fields to get to that trail, but the creature had stopped at the edge of the woods. We kept running all the way back to my cousin's place, though. We burst into the front of the door and collapsed on the ground. My cousin and his wife panicked, coming to see what the sudden commotion was all about, but I couldn't get out a word because I had broken down crying. When we finally calmed down, we tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed us. Jack and I spent the entire night huddled together. We kept the blinds down and the windows and doors locked. My cousin thought we were crazy. We kept an eye on the outside through the blinds. Whatever that thing was could still be out there. I think we were just in shock at the sight of how unnatural it looked, and we didn't want to risk getting caught by that thing. What if it broke inside and attacked all of us? We needed to be vigilant that night. Maybe it was curious about us, or maybe it was hungry. But curious is really the only way that I can describe it, because it didn't seem to want to attack us. Although, I'm sure it could have changed its mind on a moment's notice. The following morning, we cut the vacation short, making a quick, almost non-stop trip back home. I didn't want to stick around long enough for that thing to get closer to us. And Jack and I didn't even talk about it for weeks. And after some thinking, I really do think that it was some kind of werewolf or dogman. Hell, there's so many sightings of this thing all over the US that I'm starting to think they're really real. Especially after seeing something that definitely matches the description in person. As far as for what it wanted with us, who in the hell knows? Maybe it wanted to hurt us, or eat us, or drive us away from its territory. But Jack and I have another theory. Maybe it's some kind of entity, some kind of being, that enjoys savoring the looks of terror on its prey's faces, getting some sort of sick pleasure out of watching us run from it in futility. It was playing with us, like a cat would do to a tiny, defenseless mouse. Because that thing could have taken us, probably both at the same time, whenever it wanted to. Did you click on the link to view my book? If you haven't, you probably should. I guarantee you, you won't regret it. It's a hell of a story. Nighty-night, creatures of the night. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream.